Happy Halloween, everyone. I'm Lou Marinoff, and welcome to this special video as we trick or treat our way along the middle way. As some of you know, the 2020 edition of the Middle Way was recently released, and I treated my social media contacts to a free ebook copy on Amazon. That giveaway took place last week. And in return for treating them, they performed a really neat trick. They vaulted the middle way into the number one position in history and surveys in Amazon's free bookstore. And they also vaulted it to number two in political philosophy, where it keeps company with Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, Amitai Etzioni, and Daniel Defoe, among other amazing authors. So thank you to all my social media contacts for performing that amazing trick with this book in response to my small treat. But for those of you who missed it, I want to catch you up on the introduction, at least, to this 2020 edition, particularly as we trick or treat our way very close to probably the most important election in US history, certainly in living memory. So here is what I have to say about the new edition of the Middle Way, which indeed contains a lot of tricks and treats. You probably realize by now that all of humanity inhabits a place called the global village, a term coined by Marshall McLuhan during the 1960s. It's a planetary community of billions of people, not all of whom are at peace with themselves or one another on a given day. The growth and evolution of this village are ongoing and apparently unstoppable, but its inhabitants experience many kinds of growing pains, both acute and chronic. This book's first premise is that much human suffering is caused or worsened or prevented from being alleviated by extremisms of various types, ranging, for example, from religious fanaticism to moral anarchy, from functional illiteracy to deconstructed higher education, from male chauvinism to militant feminism. The second premise is that three great sages of humanity, namely Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, to whom I refer collectively as the ABCs, each taught ways to eliminate needless suffering, to guide human beings toward personal fulfillment, beneficial insight, and social balance. Each of them recognized that extremism is anathema to happiness, health, and harmony, yours and everybody else's. The ABCs share something else as well. The supremely important notion that the main purpose of being alive is to lead a virtuous life here and now. Their varying theories and practices are meant to conduce and produce goodness in this moment and the next, amounting to lasting goodness for you and for others. The ABCs are not concerned with past lives or future ones. They address heavens and hells we make here on this earth in every instant. The ABCs teach that by properly exercising the considerable power you hold over this moment in your life, you will make good things manifest for yourself and others. Inversely, they all warn that by carelessly squandering this power, you will make bad things manifest. So you decide. If you prefer fairy tales with happily ever after endings, put down this book and pick up Mother Goose. If you prefer to lead a good life now, continue reading. The book has three parts. Part one looks at civilizational dynamics that drive both cooperation and conflict in the global village and introduces each of the ABCs themselves. Chapter one explains the foundational idea of four great civilizations whose core beliefs and values are prone to diverge or conflict, yet are pressured by globalization to converge and commingle. To reconcile the extremes within, between, and among these great civilizations, Western, Islamic, Indian, and East Asian, we must decode their cultural DNA and find their common ground. Chapter 2 introduces Aristotle's golden mean, a system of virtue ethics rooted in Euclidean geometry, which helps us discover individual excellence en route to personal fulfillment. Chapter 3 introduces Buddha's middle way, a most powerful and nonviolent way to unite and align the best interests of individuals and communities alike. Chapter 4 introduces Confucius's balanced order, a system of virtue ethics rooted in yin-yang metaphysics, which helps us achieve and maintain harmony in our relationships. Chapter 5 explores the sacred geometry of the ABCs, showing how their symbols reflect their respective philosophies of morality, society, and politics. The chapter also reveals and illustrates surprising geometric links that suggest the ABCs are related by cosmic laws. Part 2 looks at some notorious extremes and explains how the ABCs can help reconcile them via the middle way. Every one of us veers toward some extreme or another at times, and so you may encounter yourself somewhere in this book, indulging in an extreme you possibly mistook for a norm. The middle way is for you too, not just for the extremists who live next door, in the nearby town, or in the neighboring country. Chapter 6 assesses political polarization, particularly in the United States, highlighting the absence of a common good in the bitter cultural struggles between radical left-wing and far right-wing extremists. Can the USA achieve civil and racial harmony? Chapter 7 examines sacred and profane extremes that emerge from religious fanaticism on the one hand and postmodern anarchy on the other. Can religious fanatics and moral anarchists find common ground? Chapter 8 looks at the paradox of tribal extremes. Natural selection favored demographic dispersion and tribal hostilities for dozens of millennia, whereas globalization now favors and forces the homogenization and commingling of tribes. Chapter 9 opens a Pandora's box of extremes, the politics of human sex difference and their associated gender wars. Can the middle way reconcile perennial conflicts between the sexes? Chapter 10 probes cognitive extremes, examining the roles of 4 cultural traditions, oral, written, visual, and digital, in both fostering and impairing cognitive development, especially in children. Chapter 11 exposes educational extremes that afflict the illiterate poor in one way and the indoctrinated affluent in another. Chapter 12 examines totemic extremes, from the branding and imposition of toxic McFoods and McDrugs to the banning of demonstrably helpful natural remedies. What does the middle way prescribe? Chapter 13 assesses economic extremes, from overabundance to dire dearth of material necessities and the avarice or desperation they engender. Chapter 14 focuses on the Middle East, a cradle of extremisms, a region where extremism is the norm. One of the great challenges confronting the global village is to find a middle way in the Middle East. Chapter 15 looks at terrorism, asking, what is it and what can we do and where's the middle way? Part 3 focuses on what you can do to apply the ABCs to the betterment of your life and the human estate. We are all nodes in a global network, and so each one of us can exert a palpable influence by applying the ABCs to reconcile extremes we encounter on a daily basis, starting on those within ourselves. Chapter 16 suggests ways of applying the ABCs here and now, as soon as you put down this book. It is both trite and true to say that the world has changed since the Middle Way was first published in 2007. Even so, this book looks at large-scale cultural processes, such as civilizational dynamics, that generally have very long wavelengths, and so require correspondingly lengthy time spans for large-scale changes to evolve. Thus, when I began to revise the manuscript in 2019, it was still largely accurate, even though it was written between 2004 and 2006. Fortunately for the book, but unfortunately for the world, many of the extremes have become only more extreme during the intervening years. For example, one of the major changes was the US economic meltdown of 2008, which I had predicted in the first edition of this book, 2007, chapter 13, and I quote, "America's economy resembles a gargantuan bubble ripe for bursting as debt-rich and cash-poor consumers strive to stay a step ahead of soaring costs and diminishing returns of the American dream," unquote. If more Americans had paid attention to this prediction when it was first published, they might have divested themselves in time to protect their hard-earned assets. I certainly took my own advice, but evidently most Americans didn't. Unfortunately, the American middle class is still reeling from a blow it helped inflict on itself through a sum total of small avarices like flipping real estate and so forth that led and fed the bigger avarices of the banking, insurance, and securities industries, who were as morally degenerate as Bernie Madoff, but who, unlike him, operated under a veneer of thinly regulated legality. Those too big to fail were bailed out by the federal government at the expense of the American middle class. In consequence, the rich got richer while everybody else got poorer. Obama, president at the time, a transparent socialist, was a political hostage to this process, partly because the alternatives he faced were probably worse. Economic war on the American middle class also features bankrupt and corrupt state and municipal governments preying on their own citizens via taxation without accountability, not dissimilar to the taxation without representation that long ago prompted the 13 colonies to seek their independence from Britain. But today's middle classes have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Demographically, the ongoing urbanization of the global village crossed a Rubicon in 2009. In that year, and for the first time in history, a majority of the human race inhabited cities instead of rural areas. Urban populations will increase even more as this century progresses. The net result will be increasing emphasis on reliable water, food, and energy supplies, particularly in more vulnerable and more densely populated coastal zones. Another important change since 2007 was the so-called Arab Spring, a pan-Arabic grassroots movement that called for long overdue political reforms and cognate modernizations in the Arab world. This has resulted in the deposition of two dictators from within: Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, a comparatively benevolent despot by Middle Eastern standards, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, a terrorist and a psychopath. With a third brutal dictator's fate, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, hanging in the balance of Syria's ongoing meltdown. At the same time, my treatment of the Arab world, chapters 14 and 15, recognizes that political reform, if it is to move in a democratic direction, will also require religious reform, in particular, the separation of mosque and state. Otherwise, the Arabian political pendulum will continue to oscillate between two undesirable extremes: brutal despotism and jihadist theocracy, with the nobler aspirations of the emergent Arab intelligentsia crushed between them. Other large-scale features of globalization addressed in the original edition of The Middle Way, including the ongoing deterioration of Western civilization, the implosion of American culture, the Islamicization of Europe, the fracturing of the EU, the rise of China's and India's economies, and the flexing of China's geopolitical muscle continue almost unabated. In 2016, please note, at conferences featuring global political and business leaders, I publicly predicted both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. These predictions did not make me popular, especially in Europe, yet they turned out to be accurate. But toward the close of 2019, few could have predicted the next extreme to engulf the entire human world, the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtually overnight, national economies and global industries, along with families and communities, were locked down and paralyzed. Governments enacted and attempted to enforce measures reminiscent of quasi-martial law, which citizens by and large accepted for their own safety, at least initially. While national economies will recover in time, many businesses, from small to mid-size and even large retail chains, were obliged to declare bankruptcy. The economic dimension of the pandemic and its rapid extinction of so many commercial entities resembled a biological mass extinction of species. Luck, liquidity, or agility, or otherwise occupying a fortuitously favorable niche, could and did make all the difference for businesses and professions, small and large alike. And just as biological mass extinctions invariably give rise to new species in novel habitats, so will humans innovate new jobs in novel or reinvented companies. But the pandemic's immediate impact, predictably, caused severe economic dislocations, which invariably heightened the danger of political destabilization. In the West, the overall transfer of wealth followed the same pattern as it has for decades. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the middle classes are bled whiter, if you'll pardon the expression. In an editorial concerning the human tragedy of this pandemic, I wrote as follows: ordinary citizens have been obliged to cope with a variety of added stresses, including deleterious existential, emotional, and psychological side effects, either of enforced solitary confinement or of being cooped up at inescapably close quarters with others. Workers with the most slender economic resources are obviously hardest hit by joblessness. Even those fortunate enough to be employed online have experienced many unwanted side effects of internet overdose, including temporal distortion, inability to disconnect, and imbalance between overactive mind and underactive body. Those whose loved ones have died in quarantine were mutually deprived not only of final goodbyes, but also of conventional funerals, along with customary rituals of mourning and grieving. So it is hardly surprising that the lockdown has exacerbated loneliness and depression on the one hand, and overall increase in alcohol and drug consumption across the board. Mental health spokespersons have estimated that the collateral damage from COVID-19 could result in more than 75,000 suicides of despair in the US alone. In sum, for many, the pandemic has made formerly good things bad, bad things worse, and worse things intolerable. End quote. Rising levels of intolerability turned locked down, frustrated, angry, and plain scared societies into powder kegs, just waiting for a spark to make them explode. That spark was unwittingly provided on May 20th, 2020, by a cold-blooded, murderous Minneapolis policeman in the wake of what began as a routine arrest. While the murder itself was bad enough, the mounting death toll and collateral damages that stem from the radical left's political hijacking of this crime are incalculably worse. Radical Democrats, are there any other kind these days, have cynically manipulated widespread feelings of powerlessness and accumulated frustration, transforming these pent-up forces into fuel for their toxic ideological agenda. They have both tolerated and fomented riots based on anarchic politics, blatant reverse racism, contempt for legitimate authority, and despite for their own country. They already suffer from infantile rage over the untenability of their own asinine myths and inevitable failures of their own anti-realist policies. For example, their suicidal pipe dream for reducing violent crime in large American cities is to defund, if not abolish, law enforcement agencies and replace them with social workers. Radical Democrat mayors unfit to run dog pounds are running American cities straight into the ground, currently in tandem with rioting, looting, arson, escalating gunfire and murder, egged on by their radical congressional counterparts who aspire to inflame insurrection nationwide and then to blame it all on President Trump. The delusional mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkan, flippantly dismissed the violent occupation and destruction of her city's downtown core by armed anarchists as a summer of love. When President Trump dispatched federal agents to Portland to protect its downtown courthouse from nightly fire bombings, among other attacks by rampaging rioters, it being a president's sworn duty to protect federal buildings and monuments, the law enforcement officers were called Gestapo by Congressman Jim Clyburn and stormtroopers by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. If such deranged utterances were made by inmates of a lunatic asylum, they could be excused on the grounds of insanity. But nowadays, such inmates are running entire wings of government. Moreover, as Speaker of the House, Pelosi is third in succession to assume the presidency itself, should heaven forfend both the incumbent president and vice president perish in office. That enforcing law and order in major American cities under attack by armed anarchists attracts comparisons to Nazi Germany by radical Democrats provides clear and compelling evidence that COVID-19 is not the greatest threat to America. Rather, it is a plague of cultural Marxism disseminated by incurably radical super spreaders like Clyburn and Pelosi that signal America's potential destruction. Since they are so fond of drawing comparisons with the Third Reich, however ill-advised, if not downright depraved, here's one that hits rather closer to the mark. On November 7th, 1938, a Jewish teenager named Herschel Greenspan shot and killed Ernst von Rath, a German diplomat in Paris. His motive? The Nazis had expelled his parents from their home in Hanover to their ethnic homeland of Poland. Even so, every rabbi whom I know would condemn that murder as unjustifiable. But this killing of von Rath by a Jew was eagerly seized upon by Hitler and Goebbels as a pretext to condemn every Jew in Germany, to incite and unleash a violent response completely out of proportion to the crime, namely Kristallnacht. During 2 days of rage, quote, Nazi mobs torched or otherwise vandalized hundreds of synagogues throughout Germany and damaged, if not completely destroyed, thousands of Jewish homes, schools, businesses, hospitals, and cemeteries. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered during the violence. Nazi officials ordered German police officers and firemen to do nothing as the riots raged and buildings burned, although firefighters were allowed to extinguish blazes that threatened Aryan-owned property, unquote. Does this sound oddly familiar? On May 20th, 2020, a white policeman named Derek Chauvin murdered a black man named George Floyd, whom he had initially arrested, then tortuously asphyxiated by applying a knee-to-neck chokehold. His motive? This has yet to be ascertained. Even so, every law enforcement officer whom I know condemned the murder as unjustifiable. But this killing of a black suspect by a white cop was eagerly seized upon by radical Democrats as a pretext to condemn every cop in America, to incite, permit, or condone a violent response completely out of proportion to the crime. In dozens of American cities, armed mobs and criminals on a riotous rampage have smashed, looted, and torched downtown buildings, including police stations, courthouses, and private businesses, have destroyed and burned police cars and civilian vehicles, have barricaded streets and toppled public monuments, have assaulted, injured, or killed dozens of police officers and civilians alike, black, white, and every other color. Democratic mayors of major cities have meanwhile defunded law enforcement, ordered police to stand down during riots and to look on passively as anarchists loot, burn, injure, and kill, wreaking havoc and creating mayhem. Unlike Kristallnacht, which lasted only 2 days, American cities have been burning for months, and at this writing, they still burn. And what is Nancy Pelosi's response to this violent insurrection? People will do what they do, she smirked. Just so. Mobs will most assuredly do what they do, especially when incited and encouraged by their sociopathic leaders, whether rabid Nazis in the 1930s or radical Democrats as we speak. Wherever mobs are permitted to rule, you can be sure that ordinary, decent, hardworking, law-abiding, tax-paying citizens have been betrayed by their morally depraved political leaders, again, whether rabid Nazis or radical Democrats. At the same time, the left has also tightened its chokehold on freedom of expression in mainstream media, which labels these riots peaceful protests. Any moderates or conservatives who dare disagree with the nonsense that delusional radicals spout and the lies that their spineless leaders parrot as unchallengeable truths see themselves canceled. Their accounts deleted by Facebook, or is it Farsebook, and Twitter, that is by the twerps at Twerpster. Their channels taken down by YouTube, excuse me, who's tube? Their websites buried by Google, which intends to gag y'all. Their reputations destroyed by CNN, the communist news network, the New York Times, aka the New York Slimes, and the Washington Post, these days the Washington Compost. Their careers publicly lynched by howling mobs of triggered social justice zombies. Freedom of thought and expression are increasingly dead letters in the USA and indeed throughout the West, whose so-called progressive extremists are perpetrating a cultural revolution that would have done Mao Zedong proud. So here's another prediction from the same voice that predicted 2008's financial crisis, 2016's Brexit, and Donald Trump's presidency. The 2020 American presidential election will be pivotal for the USA no matter who wins. It's the most decisive battle to date during a bitter, decades-long cultural civil war. If Donald Trump is reelected, he may well resuscitate the COVID comatose economy, restore law and order to American cities devastated by anarchists with the complicity of radical Democrats. But if Joe Biden wins, America herself will lose. Biden's seemingly glaring cognitive deficits make him a ventriloquist dummy for whichever female of color his Central Party Committee appoints as his running mate. I wrote those words before Kamala Harris was appointed. She will then become president if, or rather when, Biden is compelled to resign. And that's why Pelosi is rehearsing the 25th Amendment. She and her radical cronies will lead America into a new world disorder. We will witness a wholesale transformation of the American Republic into a People's Democratic Republic. One does not need a crystal ball to observe the relentless deterioration and radicalization of the Democratic Party. If John F. Kennedy were alive today, he'd look like a stalwart conservative compared to his most recent successors. Peacenik Carter, whose legacy was ruined by his inept response to the Iranian takeover of the US Embassy, lecherous Clinton, impeached for lying under oath about chasing skirt while Al-Qaeda plotted 9/11 on his watch, socialist Obama, who scuttled race relations to pre-civil rights era depths, abetted Iran's nuclear armament program, and refused to call Islamic terrorism Islamic terrorism. The Democrats have now drifted even further left into unadulterated cultural Marxism. They do not love America, rather they revile it and seek openly to destroy it. God help what remains of the free world if their implacable hatred of Trump and American values, vented daily during 4 years of vindictive propaganda, spewing like raw sewage from major media pipelines, succeeds in poisoning the minds of a beleaguered and befuddled moral majority. In sum, the middle way is far more relevant today than it was in 2007. Its main themes, namely that extremisms are inimical to human flourishing and that the ABCs of virtue ethics are effective antidotes to extremism, remain pertinent to your happiness and to the well-being of humanity alike. Please remain mindful that the middle way, at least as I conceive it, and as the ABCs themselves explain it, is in principle a conservative way. It rejects all extremes, including political extremes of the radicalized left and the bigoted far right alike. So if you are a woke radical, like Holly woke types, e.g., if you are prejudiced against whites, heterosexuals, or patriarchs, then you already dislike this book because it holds up a mirror that reflects but does not flatter your appearance. On the other extreme, if you are an entrenched bigot, e.g., if you are prejudiced against blacks, gays, or Jews, then you too already dislike this book, and for the same reason. Its mirror reflects but does not flatter you. But if you are any kind of classical liberal or libertarian or conservative liberal or tolerant conservative or non-aligned moderate, then the middle way will speak to you and for you. It will hold up a mirror in which you are happy to behold yourself, and moreover will encourage you and possibly even empower you to make the world a happier place for yourself and for others. So trick or treat, my friends. And as we trick or treat this night along the middle way, let's hope that the radical Democrats do not trick you into electing them a few days hence, because if they do, you will be treated to the destruction of the greatest defender of liberty and freedom that the world has ever known, namely the United States of America. God bless America. God bless all who defend her virtues. And may God protect us and preserve us from the scourge and toxic ideology of cultural Marxism and all its malignant destroyers. Trick or treat, my friends. Happy Halloween to you.